Blood dripped from the imported marble stairs, pooling just inches from the silver tray she dropped. The most feared man in Chicago had stepped out of his elevator, but before he could speak, his trembling, plus-sized maid clamped a hand over his mouth and whispered, "Stay quiet." The skyline of Chicago was a jagged expanse of steel and glass, a city built on wind and corruption, entirely dominated by the Rizzo Syndicate. At the apex of this food chain was Antonio Rizzo. He was a man carved from ice, trauma, and calculated violence. At 32, Antonio ruled the Midwest underworld with a terrifying efficiency. He lived in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse in the Gold Coast, a fortress in the sky equipped with bulletproof glass, reinforced steel doors, and a private elevator. It was a place designed to keep his enemies out. He never expected the threat to come from inside. Paola Bianchi was practically invisible to the criminal empire that funded her meager paychecks. She was the maid. At 24, Paola carried the weight of her family's crushing debts, surviving by scrubbing the blood and bourbon stains out of Antonio Rizzo's Persian rugs. She was a plus-sized woman in a world that valued sharp, lethal edges. Her soft curves, rounded face, and quiet demeanor made her a ghost in the penthouse. The guards ignored her, the capos dismissed her, and the other staff treated her like a stepping stone. But Paola possessed a profound, hidden resilience. She had grown up in the crossfire of the West Side, learning early that survival meant blending into the background and observing everything. Nothing escaped her notice. What Paola did not know was that she was far from invisible to the master of the house. Antonio was a man surrounded by vipers, fake smiles, and hollow allegiances. To him, Paola was an anomaly. He had watched her on the security feeds for months. He noted the careful, respectful way she moved through his personal space. He saw the quiet dignity she maintained when his drunken underbosses threw insults her way. Antonio was a ruthless monster to the outside world, ordering hits and dismantling rival families without a second thought. But when it came to Paola Bianchi, a dark, consuming obsession had taken root in his chest. He was fiercely protective of his quiet maid, secretly orchestrating the firing of any guard who looked at her the wrong way. The incident began on a suffocatingly humid Tuesday afternoon. Antonio was supposed to be in a sit-down with the remaining heads of the Detroit factions until midnight. Paola was scheduled for a deep clean of the upper floor. As Paola dusted the imported bookshelves in the grand library, her sharp senses caught a disruption in the penthouse's rhythm. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning was usually accompanied by the heavy footsteps of the two guards stationed by the stairwell. Now there was only silence. She moved toward the hallway, her pulse quickening. On the pristine hardwood floor, she spotted a fresh scuff mark, a muddy boot print. The security detail wore custom loafers, and they never tracked mud. Paola crept toward the living room, pressing her back against the cool plaster of the corridor. From the reflection in a gilded mirror, she saw them. 5 men in tactical gear, armed with suppressed submachine guns, systematically dismantling the security cameras. They were planting explosive charges on the reinforced doors of Antonio's master suite, preparing a kill box for whenever the boss returned. They were professionals. Panic threatened to freeze her, but the street-smart resilience honed over years of hardship kicked in. She knew she had to trigger the silent alarm, but before she could move, the soft, distinctive chime of the private elevator echoed through the foyer. Antonio was coming home early. The armed men immediately broke from their tasks, raising their weapons and taking up tactical positions around the elevator doors. They formed a firing squad, waiting for the stainless steel panels to slide open. Paola did not think about the danger. She did not think about the fact that she was just a maid who could easily slip down the service stairs and disappear. She only thought of Antonio, moving with a surprising agility that defied her soft frame. Paola bypassed the main corridor and slipped through the adjacent catering kitchen. The elevator doors began to part. Antonio Rizzo, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, exhausted from a grueling negotiation, took half a step into his foyer. Before his foot could fully touch the marble floor, a pair of warm, trembling arms yanked him violently to the side, dragging him into the darkened alcove of the coat room. Antonio reacted with lethal instinct, his hand flashing to the custom firearm holstered at his waist, ready to snap the neck of whoever had grabbed him. But before he could strike, a soft, calloused hand clamped firmly over his mouth. He looked down. Paola Bianchi, her face pale and her dark eyes wide with terror, was pressing her plush body flush against his. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her breath hot against his jaw. Through the narrow gap of the coat room door, Antonio saw what she had saved him from. The 5 gunmen had their weapons trained on the empty elevator car, their lasers cutting through the dim lighting of the foyer. If he had taken one more step, he would have been shredded by 50 rounds of suppressed gunfire. The realization hit Antonio like a physical blow. His own fortress had been breached, his elite security detail likely slaughtered, and the only thing standing between him and a violent death was his quiet, plus-sized maid. His heart pounded against his ribs, not from the adrenaline of the ambush, but from the realization that Paola had risked her life for his. He slowly brought his large hand up and gently wrapped his fingers around her wrist, pulling her hand away from his mouth. He did not let go. His thumb traced the frantic pulse jumping in her veins. He gave her a single, slow nod, communicating a silent promise that he had the situation under control. Paola leaned closer, her lips brushing his ear, sending an involuntary shiver down his spine, despite the imminent danger. "There are furtive in the foyer," she breathed, her voice barely a thread of sound. 2 more went toward your office. They disabled the main cameras, but they missed the backup circuit in the HVAC system. Antonio narrowed his eyes, profoundly impressed. Most seasoned gangsters would have panicked, but Paola was delivering tactical intel with terrifying clarity. He pulled his gun and pointed toward the service door at the back of the coat room. It led to the labyrinth of maintenance corridors built into the walls of the skyscraper, spaces meant for electricians and plumbers. Paola nodded. She reached into her apron pocket and produced the master keycard she used for her cleaning routes. As they slipped into the narrow, pitch-black maintenance shaft, the space was incredibly tight. Antonio had to press himself entirely against Paola to allow the heavy steel door to click shut behind them. In the oppressive darkness, surrounded by the hum of massive ventilation pipes, the physical reality of their situation took hold. Paola was soft, warm, and smelling faintly of vanilla and heavy duty floor cleaner. Antonio felt the gentle curve of her hips against his thighs, the rapid rise and fall of her chest against his chest. For a man who lived a life devoid of genuine comfort, the sensation of her body was intoxicating. His protective instincts, already fiercely dedicated to her in secret, morphed into a violent, consuming need to keep her safe at all costs. They navigated the narrow shafts, Paola leading the way. Her knowledge of the penthouse was intimate, born from years of scrubbing every inch of it. She guided him past the living room vents, where they could hear the muffled, angry voices of the hitmen, realizing the elevator was empty. "Where is he?" a rough voice barked through the vent grate. "The boss said he was in the car. Find him. Tabitha wants his head in a box by midnight." Antonio stopped dead in the shaft, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ground together. Tabitha. Tabitha Vogel. The Vogel cartel operated out of the Pacific Northwest, controlling the shipping ports and a massive narcotics pipeline. Tabitha Vogel was a ruthless, icy sociopath who had recently pushed her operations into Chicago. She had requested a meeting with Antonio 2 weeks ago, proposing a marriage of convenience to merge their empires. Antonio had laughed in her face, insulted by her audacity and repulsed by her cruelty. This was her response, a hostile takeover. They reached the exit hatch near the rooftop helipad access. Antonio pushed the grate open and helped Paula climb out into the dimly lit utility stairwell. As soon as she was out of the claustrophobic shaft, Paula staggered, the adrenaline finally crashing. Her knees buckled, but Antonio caught her instantly, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her solid weight against him. "I have you," he murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her. "You are safe." Paula looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his unreadable face. "They are going to tear the building apart looking for you, Mr. Rizzo." "Antonio," he corrected her softly. "To you it is always Antonio." He gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his touch lingering on her skin. "You saved my life, Paula." "Why?" "You owe me nothing. You could have walked away." Paula straightened up, pulling away slightly, though Antonio kept his hands firmly on her waist. "I am a maid, Antonio. I am practically invisible. I see how the men look at me, like I am taking up too much space and no space at all. But you never looked at me like that. You made sure the kitchen staff fed me well. You fired Lorenzo when he cornered me in the laundry room last month. You thought I did not know it was you, but I did." Antonio stared at her, the depths of his obsession swelling to the surface. She was brilliant. She had seen right through his stoic, terrifying facade. "We need to move," Paula said, shifting the dynamic. Her voice grew steady, the hidden strength in her core radiating outward. "Tabitha Vogel is impatient. I saw the men in the foyer. They have the insignia of the Iron Wolves tattooed on their necks. They are mercenaries. They do not know the layout of the lower garage levels. If we take the freight elevator to sub-level 3, we can bypass the main lobby lockdown." Antonio felt a dark, thrilling smirk pull at the corner of his mouth. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a scrambled number that connected directly to his most loyal capos. He held Paula's gaze as the line connected. "Burn the penthouse," Antonio commanded into the phone, his eyes never leaving the beautiful, resilient woman standing before him. Tabitha Vogel just declared war. "Send every man we have. Trap the mercenaries inside." He hung up the phone and looked back at Paula, stepping closer until there was no space between them. The ruthless mafia boss of Chicago made a silent vow in that dimly lit stairwell. He was going to slaughter Tabitha Vogel for daring to bring violence to his home. And when the blood was washed away, Paula Bianchi would never scrub another floor for the rest of her life. She was going to rule by his side. The heavy steel doors of the service stairwell clanged shut behind them, plunging Antonio and Paula into the stark, fluorescent-lit corridor of the mechanical floor. The air here smelled of ozone, heavy grease, and the metallic tang of industrial machinery. It was a stark contrast to the imported incense and polished wood of the penthouse above. For Paula, this was her domain, the hidden skeleton of the building she navigated daily to avoid the arrogant capos and cruel associates of the Rizzo syndicate. For Antonio, it was a tactical advantage, a maze that would buy them the time they needed. Antonio kept one hand firmly pressed against the small of Paola's back, a grounding, possessive weight that guided her forward. His other hand held his custom matte black pistol, steady and lethal. He moved with a predatory grace, his tailored suit completely at odds with the grimy surroundings. Yet he looked more dangerous here than he ever did in a boardroom. They reached the freight elevator at the end of the hall. It was a massive, scarred metal box used for transporting heavy furniture and construction supplies. Paola swiped her master keycard over the worn sensor. The panel blinked green, and the heavy grated doors groaned open. "Step to the back corner," Antonio instructed, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Keep yourself behind me." Paola obeyed, pressing her soft curves into the cold steel corner of the cab. Antonio stood in front of her, a broad, immovable shield. As the elevator began its descent, the mechanical whine of the pulleys echoed in the cramped space. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Paola looked at the broad expanse of Antonio's back, realizing the sheer absurdity of the situation. The most feared mafia boss in Chicago was bleeding from a small scrape on his jaw. His tie was discarded, and he was risking everything to ensure the survival of his maid. "Why did you not just leave me in the coat room?" Paola asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Her voice was steady, despite the trembling in her hands. "You could have fought your way out faster alone. I would have just slowed you down." Antonio slowly turned his head, looking over his shoulder. The harsh overhead light cast deep, menacing shadows over his sharp features. But when his eyes met hers, the cold, dead gaze of the ruthless killer vanished, replaced by a burning, intense heat that made Paola's breath catch. "You are the only reason I am breathing right now, Paola," Antonio said, his tone possessing a dark sincerity that sent a shiver down her spine. "You did not freeze. You did not scream. You protected me. In my world, loyalty is bought with blood or money, and it is almost always fake. But what you did up there, that was pure. You think you are invisible, but I have seen you every single day. I see the quiet strength you carry. You do not slow me down. You are the only real thing in my life." Before Paola could process the heavy, intoxicating weight of his words, the elevator suddenly jolted, grinding to a halt. The digital display above the door flickered and died. They were stuck on sub-level 1, the service bay for the building's maintenance trucks. "Someone cut the power grid to the lower floors," Antonio stated grimly, turning his full attention back to the reinforced doors. "Tabitha is thorough. We have to pry these open and take the ramp down to sub-level 3. He holstered his weapon and wedged his powerful fingers into the crack between the heavy doors, straining against the hydraulic locks. Paola stepped forward to help, wedging her hands beside his, using her body weight to pull. Slowly, agonizingly, the doors parted just enough for them to squeeze through. They slipped into the dimly lit service bay. The cavernous room was filled with shadows and the hulking shapes of garbage compactors and delivery vans. Antonio drew his gun again, sweeping the perimeter. "Clear," he whispered, motioning for Paola to follow. But as they moved past a row of industrial dumpsters, a massive figure stepped out from the darkness, blocking their path. He was one of the Iron Wolves, heavily armored and carrying a tactical shotgun. He spotted them instantly. Without missing a beat, Antonio lunged, tackling the mercenary before the man could raise his weapon. It was a calculated risk. A gunshot would echo through the concrete garage and draw every killer in the building to their exact location. Antonio had to silence him with his bare hands. The two men crashed into a stack of empty steel drums, the sickening thud of bone hitting metal echoing in the bay. The mercenary was a giant of a man, fueled by adrenaline, and he managed to throw Antonio off, scrambling to reach the dropped shotgun. Antonio recovered quickly, delivering a brutal knee to the man's ribs, but the mercenary countered with a heavy punch that clipped Antonio's jaw, sending him stumbling back. Paola watched the violent struggle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was not a fighter. She had no combat training, but she had spent her life surviving, and she refused to let the man who had just promised her the world die on a greasy garage floor. Her eyes darted around the immediate area. Beside the dumpsters sat a custodian's heavy utility cart. On top of it was a large, industrial-grade jug of corrosive floor stripper, the kind of chemical so toxic Paola was required to wear heavy goggles and a respirator when diluting it. The mercenary had his hands wrapped around Antonio's throat, pressing the Mafia Boss against a concrete pillar. Antonio's hands gripped the man's wrists, his muscles bulging as he fought for air. Paola moved with silent, desperate speed. She uncapped the jug of corrosive stripper. It was heavy, but adrenaline surged through her veins, granting her a strength she never knew she possessed. She stepped right up behind the towering mercenary, raised the heavy jug, and splashed the raw, undiluted chemical directly over the back of the man's tactical helmet and down his neck. The effect was instantaneous. The mercenary let out a blood-curdling scream as the corrosive liquid seeped through his tactical gear and hit his skin, burning him severely. He dropped his grip on Antonio, clawing frantically at his own neck and helmet. Freed from the chokehold, Antonio wasted no time. He grabbed the heavy metal pipe that had fallen from the utility cart and delivered a single, devastating strike to the side of the mercenary's head. The man collapsed to the concrete, out cold. Antonio stood there, chest heaving, wiping a smear of blood from his split lip. He looked at the unconscious giant, then slowly turned his gaze to Paola. She was standing there, clutching the empty chemical jug, breathing heavily, her dark hair falling out of its messy bun. She looked terrified, yet utterly magnificent. "Remind me never to complain about the cleaning supplies you use," Antonio rasped, a dark, breathless chuckle escaping his lips. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, dropping the metal pipe. He took the empty jug from her shaking hands and tossed it aside, then pulled her flush against his chest. His large hands tangled in her hair, tilting her face up to his. "You are incredible," he murmured, his voice thick with a mixture of adrenaline and raw, unfiltered lust. His thumb stroked her cheek, smearing a bit of grease, but he did not care. "You saved me again, Paola." "I am just doing my job, Mr. Rizzo," she breathed, trying to inject a bit of levity into the terrifying moment, though she melted into his embrace, cleaning up the trash. Antonio let out a low growl, leaning down until his lips were a breath away from hers. "I told you, my name is Antonio, and after tonight, you are never touching a mop again. You are going to sit at the head of my table." The echoing screech of tires tearing across concrete shattered the intimate moment. Headlights swept across the service bay, casting long, menacing shadows against the walls. 2 heavily armored black SUVs skidded to a halt, blocking the concrete ramp that led down to sub-level 3. The doors swung open, and out stepped 4 men armed with assault rifles, followed closely by a woman who radiated an aura of pure, icy venom. Tabitha Fogel. She was tall, strikingly thin, and dressed in a tailored white suit that seemed to mock the grime of the underground garage. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back into a severe knot, and her sharp, angular face was twisted into a cruel smile. She held a silver-plated revolver, tapping it idly against her thigh as she surveyed the scene. "Well, well, well." Tabitha's voice echoed through the cavernous space, sharp and aristocratic. "I must admit, Antonio, I am disappointed. I expected the great boss of the Chicago syndicate to go down fighting in his penthouse, surrounded by his elite guard. Instead, I find you scuttling in the basement like a rat." Antonio stepped completely in front of Paola, shielding her soft frame with his own. His posture was relaxed, exuding the terrifying, lethal calm that had earned him his reputation. "You always were dramatic, Tabitha," Antonio replied, his voice echoing back, smooth and completely unfazed. "Breaking into my home, damaging my property. It is desperate, even for the Vogel cartel. You cannot take my city, so you try an assassination. It is pathetic." Tabitha's eyes narrowed, the insult hitting its mark. Her gaze shifted, catching sight of the woman trembling slightly behind Antonio's massive shoulders. She let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "And who is this?" Tabitha sneered, taking a step forward. "Your human shield? A bit broad for the job, isn't she? I knew your tastes ran a bit strange, Antonio. But a chubby maid? Really? You are trusting your life to the help?" Paola felt a familiar sting of humiliation at the cruel words. For years, she had been told she was too big, too soft, too invisible. But as she looked at Tabitha's sneering face, and then felt the solid, unyielding heat of Antonio's back against her front, the humiliation vanished. It was replaced by a sudden, fierce anger. She was not just a maid anymore. She was the woman who had kept the most dangerous man in Chicago alive tonight. Before Antonio could unleash the violent threat sitting on his tongue, Paola stepped out from behind him. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the Mafia Boss, her chin raised, her dark eyes glaring back at the cartel leader. "He is not trusting his life to the help," Paola said, her voice surprisingly loud and clear, echoing off the concrete walls. "He is trusting his life to the woman who outsmarted your elite mercenaries, using nothing but a master key and floor cleaner. You broke into his house, Tabitha, but you forgot to ask who cleans it up." Tabitha blinked, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of the plus-sized woman in the stained uniform, daring to speak to her. A vicious snarl twisted her pristine features. "Kill them both!" she snapped at her guards. "Shoot the fat one first!" The mercenaries raised their rifles, but Antonio did not flinch. He did not raise his gun. He simply looked at his luxury watch. "Right on time," Antonio whispered. Before the mercenaries could pull their triggers, the deafening roar of high-performance engines ripped through the subterranean garage. From the ramp behind Tabitha, 3 massive armored transport trucks slammed into the blockade, crushing the rear of Tabitha's SUVs. The heavy steel doors of the trucks blew open, and over 30 heavily armed capos of the Rizzo syndicate poured out into the garage. They were Antonio's most loyal enforcers, and they flooded the space with overwhelming firepower. The garage erupted into chaos. Gunfire deafened the air. Concrete dust rained down from the ceiling, and the tactical advantage instantly flipped. The Iron Wolves were completely outnumbered and outgunned. Antonio grabbed Paola by the waist, tackling her behind the thick, reinforced concrete pillar of the service bay as bullets chewed into the plaster where they had just stood. He covered her body completely with his own, pressing her into the floor, shielding her ears from the concussive blasts of the gunfire. "Do not move," he commanded, his eyes blazing with a protective fury. The firefight was brutal, but brief. The Rizzo Syndicate showed absolutely no mercy to the invaders. Within 2 minutes, the gunfire ceased, replaced by the groans of the dying and the heavy footsteps of Antonio's men securing the perimeter. Antonio stood up, pulling Paola with him, checking her frantically for any injuries. Finding none, he turned his attention back to the carnage. Tabitha Vogel was crawling on the ground, her pristine white suit ruined with dirt and a deep crimson stain spreading across her shoulder. Her remaining men were dead or subdued. She looked up as Antonio approached her, his gun drawn, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying darkness. "You think this changes anything?" Tabitha spat, coughing up blood. "My family will wage war on this city. We will burn your empire to the ground." Antonio stood over her, his shadow swallowing her completely. "You do not have an empire anymore, Tabitha. While you were playing dress-up in my garage, my men hit your shipping ports in Seattle. You are bankrupt. You have nothing." He raised his gun, aiming directly at her forehead. "And you made one fatal mistake tonight, Tabitha," Antonio said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You insulted my queen." Antonio pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the silent garage, and Tabitha Vogel collapsed onto the concrete, lifeless. Silence fell over the subterranean floor. The capos of the Rizzo Syndicate stood at attention, waiting for their boss's next command. Antonio did not look at them. He holstered his weapon and turned, walking back to the concrete pillar where Paola stood. She was pale, shaking from the aftermath of the violence, but she held her ground, looking at the man who had just dismantled an empire for her. Antonio stopped in front of her. He reached out, gently cupping her face with his blood-stained hands, his thumb smoothing over her cheek. "It is over," he said softly, "entirely for her. My penthouse is ruined. We will have to stay at the estate in Lake Forest for a while." Paola looked up into his dark, obsessive eyes, realizing that the quiet life she had known was entirely gone. She was standing in the middle of a war zone, surrounded by killers, and the most terrifying monster of them all was looking at her like she was the only thing in the universe that mattered. "Who is going to clean the estate?" Paola asked, a shaky, breathless smile breaking through her terror. Antonio let out a deep, genuine laugh, a sound that none of his men had ever heard before. He pulled her flush against his chest, wrapping his arms securely around her soft, beautiful body. "We will hire a whole fleet," he promised, pressing a fierce, possessive kiss into her hair. "But you, Paola Bianchi, are never lifting a finger again. You are mine now. You are going to rule this city by my side." And as the Mafia Boss carried his plus-sized maid out of the subterranean garage, past the wreckage of their enemies, Paola knew she would never be invisible again. Did this dark mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved the intense dynamic between the ruthless Antonio Rizzo and the incredibly resilient Paola Bianchi, make sure to like this video and share it with your fellow romance fans. Tell us your favorite moment in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another gripping story.